Depending on your point of view, today Fitchburg is either blessed or cursed with old housing stock. Some have been rehabbed, shining examples of architectural gems. Others have not been successful in standing the test of time, falling into disrepair. The purposes of these buildings have changed too. What are now private homes might once have housed an orphanage, a lodging house for single workers, or a sanatorium or infirmary for the ill. Some buildings have disappeared. Still others remain truer to the original intent of the builder. Hastings Hall was built in 1908 as a residence for professional single women. Each worker had a private room. Meals were prepared for the residents in a large kitchen. Today, the building is permanent housing for single adult men and women. Residents use the common areas downstairs and outside. Men and women are housed in separate areas of the building. No visiting allowed. Unlike the more pampered residents of old, these men and women have to do their own cooking in the giant kitchen. The Hotel Raymond was a commercial hotel off Lower Main Street. Now it is marketed as affordable apartments. The Thunderbird Motel, a hostelry of dubious repute, made way for a car lot. Kaliva Hall, bought by the Finnish Knights and Ladies of Kaliva in 1926, provided a meeting room, a 200-volume library, and dining and eating areas for the immigrant society. The third floor was rented out as an apartment. Today, the owners are rehabbing the former Crocker family house back into a single-family dwelling. Fitchburg State University occupies the Cedar Street home. It is now used as a women's dormitory. Opened in 1900, the Cedar Street Home for Old Ladies was an exclusive operation. Residents paid a hefty fee to get in and a monthly fee for care. For a long time, only old ladies were allowed. Joan Goodwin, now director of the Senior Center, worked at the home in 1979 after she completed nursing school.
Cedar Street Rest Home, or as they called it, the Old Lady Home in Fitchburg, was managed by Miss Lovering, and I believe there was a board of directors. I met only a few of the board of directors back then in 1979. I always felt it was kind of an elite group of people, but Miss Lovering was pretty much the boss and ran the facility.
Times were changing.
It was all women when I started, but we had our first gentleman arrive, a very lovely man, and I remember back then there was a whole big concern about this gentleman moving into, the facility, but they decided to make amends. They had a particular room that was available that was kind of off to the side from where the ladies were.
Elder care has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Eleanor Gilmartin and members of her family have been part of the effort to care for seniors in need for much of the past 80 years.
Elder service is kind of a family thing. In 1933, my father-in-law, John Gilmartin, Jack Gilmartin, was a state representative. And he worked to get a bill passed called the Old Age Assistance Bill, which provided a small stipend to people who were retired. And then it was 2 years later when the Social Security bill was passed, which gave people, a little money in their pocket to live on.
After working as a director of Fitchburg's Council on Aging, Eleanor was named the founding director of the Montechusett Home Healthcare Corporation in 1974.
The state decided it wanted to save Medicaid money that was being spent to keep people older people in nursing homes. And they thought, well, if we can spend less money by keeping people at home and provide a few hours of the kind of help they need, that'd be good, and people would prefer that, and it would save Medicaid dollars. So they started a corporation, an example in Worcester, and decided to go statewide with it. So advertised for people to take over and to found, actually, a corporation in north central Massachusetts.
Eleanor's son, David Gilmartin, served as mayor of Fitchburg. He carried the family torch.
So when David came along, he was aware of my work with the Council on Aging, my work with Montechusett Home Care, his grandfather's interest, and so he was interested in finding community block money to rehab the Armory into a senior center. Named it the John Gilmartin Senior Center in honor of his grandfather.
Organizations like Montechusett Home Healthcare and the Council on Aging both work to assist elders in the community. Some services the elderly might require from the senior center or a healthcare corporation are very concrete.
We're basically there to assess the needs of seniors and to see what their needs are and to try and address their needs and help them out to the best of our ability.
Other programs keep seniors active and engaged.
That's another fact about aging. People are healthier, aging and more healthy as they age, and more active in the community and more active as volunteers. You know, you look around at the older age group, and there are a lot of very active, vibrant, healthy people about.
So I'm really proud to say that our life enrichment program at the Senior Center and all the different programs involved have really expanded over the last 2 years.
What happened to elderly people if they had no family, no money, and needed help before Social Security and Medicaid?
Social Security was implemented in 1935. And before that, if people could no longer work, there was no income unless they had saved some money. So what did they do? I mean, they were taken care of by their children. And were taken care of. And if they needed care, they'd have to move in with their children or go to the poor farm. Do you ever remember the poor farm? It was down on Winoosknock Road. I tell young people that now, and they think I'm, having a senior moment. But no, there was a poor farm on Winoosknock Road, and many communities had poor farms.
Fitchburg's Poor Farm is now the site of Flack Collaborative, which offers services for special needs children. Called at various times the City Farm, the Almshouse, or the Workhouse, the town-run institution provided 3 hots and a cot for not only impoverished seniors, but for non-criminal lunatics, drunkards, pregnant women, and families as well. The farm opened on land purchased in the 1840s when Massachusetts passed the pauper laws, requiring towns to support the indigent. Transients were not welcome. Before the poorhouse opened, indigents were auctioned off to the lowest bidder. Locals bid on how little they would charge the town each week to board a pauper. Presumably, some able-bodied paupers were more welcome than the truly feeble. Not all eccentrics required alms. Joe Palmer, a farmer in the town's No-Town area, refused to cut his beard. In 1830, in front of the Fitchburg Hotel, he was jumped by men attempting to remove the offensive whiskers, and he defended himself with a knife. He refused to pay a fine and served a year in the Worcester County Jail for the attack. Eccentricity might have run in the family. Joe's son Tom became a painless dentist, pioneering the use of ether for tooth extractions. He built a 35-room octagonal house on Main Street. The truly insane who were in need of housing were often relegated to the poorhouse. Children received room and board at the city's poor farm also. They were expected to go to school if they were not otherwise employed. Massachusetts began limiting the hours children could work in the 1830s, but with a 10-hour workday and only 3 months off for school, learning was clearly not a priority for needy children. Immigrant workers died early, often of highly contagious diseases spread in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Their children could then be left orphans with no family around to feed and house them. Fitchburg had a children's home near Lower Main Street. Catholic Charities was on Highland Street, and the French Protestants ran an orphanage on South Street, where Notre Dame High School is now. John Joyce arrived from Boston on an orphan train in 1905. He was 3. His father died of pneumonia and his mother of typhus. The Catholic orphanage in Boston shipped the children out of town to be cared for by strangers. Left on the steps of St. Francis with other children, John was one of the lucky ones. Older children were sometimes put immediately to work in the mills. Taken in by a childless couple, the Seneschals, he was known as John Seneschal. When he tried to enlist in the Navy, he learned his last name was really Joyce. As was common, he was never officially adopted. A diminutive woolen jacket and a mitten made from a sock and chewed through from worry are the only things John took on the train and into his new life. Naturally, Fitchburg has had its fair share of criminals and ne'er-do-wells. The Fitchburg jail, where the Wachusett potato chip factory now is, could house close to 100 prisoners. Conditions were considered admirable by state inspectors. The jail had 6 bathtubs for the inmates to share. During the war, Southern female spies were housed in their own section of the jail. These sometimes genteel, sometimes obstreperous women received special treatment. Potted plants and birds lined the corridors where their cells were, presenting a very pretty appearance, it was said. Alcohol abuse has been a problem throughout Fitchburg's history. Indigent drunkards were confined to the poorhouse, and the city took steps to limit the sale of alcohol. Fitchburg was dry for nearly 10 years and made newspaper stories around the country in 1907 when voters repealed the anti-liquor laws at a time when other towns were instituting dry laws. A Fitchburg minister, preaching drinking in moderation, was quoted by the Pabst Brewing Company in an advertisement run across the country one year before the law was repealed in Fitchburg. An innovative system of state hospitals for the insane started in Worcester in 1833. However, the state charged towns for each patient. It was cheaper for Fitchburg to build a padded cell or 3 in the poorhouse or the county jail and confine the mentally ill, the violent, and the uncontrollable right here in town. Over time, though, the insane were moved to the state hospitals and were not a presence on the city streets. Even with improved mental health facilities, people who needed help remained in Fitchburg through the 1960s and 70s. They were cared for by a group effort from merchants and public safety officials. Joan Goodwin went to Fitchburg High School in the mid-1970s. Although she lived in West Fitchburg, she got to know who the street people were during her after-school walks.
Back then, even though I lived way out in West Fitchburg, not really a part of the city, but even then, you know, we knew of, there was Harvey Zaker, nice guy, but I always recognized Harvey. Jimmy, I think we used to call him Jimmy Nezer. I don't know if that was his full name, but I remember Jimmy walking up and down Main Street, very nice guy, but obviously, recognizing that he was different. I remember the Mountain Man, seeing the Mountain Man, again, walking up and down Main Street. Those are pretty much the 3 that I remember.
In the mid-1970s, the state began deinstitutionalizing residents of the state hospitals. Thanks to the advances of pharmaceuticals, some victims of mental illness could function on their own. But after years of living in a state hospital, many of these people had no living skills. Peter Marquis was a case manager for the welfare department in Gardner when the Gardner State Hospital closed.
I was there at the time they emptied Gardner State Hospital. It was a good thing and it was a bad thing. There were many people that didn't belong there, and they needed to be appropriately placed, and they were. And then the bad thing was that a lot of people were just flushed out of the system and never heard from again.
Now, instead of facing just the specter of alcoholism, former mental patients had learned the joys of recreational drug use.
I met this woman, and at age 19, her very strict family found out that she had an amphetamine habit. They committed her to Gardner State Hospital. Other than that amphetamine habit, there was nothing wrong with her. She was a bright woman. She was personable. This is who I met. At 19, thus began her 20-year relationship with Gardner State Hospital. She was in and out, in and out, in and out. And in that 20-year sojourn, she learned how to be a drug addict.
Over the years, it was a challenge for Peter and his girlfriend to monitor the woman's safety.
And we would just peek into her room every day to see if she was still breathing. And that was it for the rest of her life until she died of cancer later on.
After the closing of Gardner State Hospital in 1975, the visible homeless population of Fitchburg streets seemed to increase. Homeless people are now a common sight in the downtown area. Today, Joan Goodwin spends her working days in downtown Fitchburg.
Well, I see a big difference. Obviously now, the homeless people, we don't have names connected to them. And it's funny because a lot of them do come to the senior center, whether they come in for a hot cup of coffee, whether they come in for meat, bread, or pastry twice a week, which we do offer. I recognize them, but there's no names attached to them.
Kevin McLean, a case manager and outreach worker for Our Father's House, a Fitchburg homeless shelter, also sees the anonymity of the street people.
I encourage people to get to know people on the street. You know, part of doing outreach is, again, just going and talking to people, but we all kind of do outreach in our own way. You walk down the street, you see somebody You know, whether you want to help them or buy them a lunch, or don't give them money, but give them money. Or even if you want to if you don't know what to do, you pick up the phone and call somebody and say, I'm concerned about somebody I saw.
For Kevin, the street people are individuals worthy of attention and assistance. His job requires him to get to know them in order to assist them.
In my truck, I carry water, juice, crackers, socks, blankets. Keep them in the back of my truck all the time. Yeah, I got a young kid who is 27 years old. Found him underneath the wind tunnel. A lot of people stay underneath there, a couple of mattresses under there. I was doing outreach one Monday night, and I engaged this young man. I had some food left over from the shelter. It was 9 o'clock at night or so. I had a couple of plates, and I knew this kid was staying there, so I made my way over and introduced myself. Young kid, fairly articulate. Surprised me that he was out there. Good-looking kid. Addicted to heroin. Got kicked out of his parents' house, got kicked out of everywhere he was because of his heroin addiction. But I gave him the plate of food. I carry a camera with me, and I take everybody's picture that I meet on the street.
The next evening, Kevin took the young man's picture and showed it to him.
It's almost 6 months now he's been clean. He went from there, as soon as he saw that picture, he said, I just never realized that was me. I never realized I was that desperate. He was shoveling food in.
Now, the former high school athlete and drug addict is in recovery.
He is now in an apartment with his girlfriend from assistance from our father's house. He's not too far from here. He's doing quite well. He's sober. He's on methadone, but he's doing quite well.
Kevin Curran, a deputy chief in the fire department, has worked with the homeless also.
I know when I first started on this job 26 years ago, I'd be with a, who today would be called an old coot, but back then it was one of the senior firefighters. And it's, you know, we'd look at somebody who was homeless under a bridge and it'd say, see that guy over there came in? Says that kid back in 1962 used to be the best shortstop for Fitchburg High. You know, and then it'd go on about what happened, you know, in this kid's life and what actually made him or eventually led him to become a homeless person. So my personal observations are they're your brothers, sisters, daughters, aunts, uncles, they're townies.
Joel Caddy is a retired police officer from Fitchburg. At the beginning of his career in 1978, he was assigned to a cruiser in Cleghorn.
Back, I want to say, in the middle 80s, we had a homeless shelter in Cleghorn. At the time, it wasn't called the Norman Valentin Shelter, but it ended up being the Norman Valentin Shelter. It was a wet shelter.
Officers would take people there or to an out-of-town detox center if they were withdrawing from drugs or drink.
Back then, there were a lot of street people, especially in the cold weather. The place would be packed, and I mean, it was. I mean, the police really didn't go in there. We would drop somebody there, but we really wouldn't go in, and it became a health hazard. There were so many people living, and the conditions were terrible.
As a result, the Valentin shelter opened as a wet shelter in Cleghorn. Joel served on the board. It was closed in 2010 after 15 years of operation. Code violations abounded, and the place was allegedly infested with bedbugs. Now, there is no wet shelter in Fitchburg. Years ago, the police would let people dry out overnight at the station.
I've picked up Harvey some nights. He smelled deplorable. He had gone to the bathroom on himself. Literally would have to pick him up off the ground, carry him to the cruiser, get him to a detox. Again, when in the detox in Leominster, and I think maybe the time between that and the Norman Valentin shelter, the police department had nowhere to bring anybody. We would take them in at the police department to keep them warm. However, you understand that the police department owns the liability. If you brought someone into the police department that had too much to drink and they died in the police department, you could be liable. So it's rare today because of that you would take somebody in.
The police still try to help out when they can.
The police department here is pretty good. They're pretty understanding. They really work. Say I get a call at 1 in the morning from the police department, which I do answer my phone 24/7. Someone's, you know, they got someone that's homeless, what should they do? Well, the police are now letting them stay in their lobby until I come at 9 o'clock in the morning and do an assessment.
Money is always an issue. The visible presence of homeless people stops people from patronizing Main Street.
What does the city do? What does it cost us? What does it cost the Main Street business people? What does it cost them in revenue? We have a state college that between state funding, federal funding, private money, we're trying to bring college kids to Main Street, but we're bringing them down to Main Street, and we have these street people all around that area. So they're costing the city. If you go to Lunenburg, if you go to Groton, you don't see street people drunk on Main Street. In a city like Fitchburg, we do. I mean, it's a great problem. I don't want to tell anybody it's safe to walk, but I don't want to tell anybody it's not safe to walk. I mean, I walked out there for a long time, and I never really felt threatened on Main Street. But we're fighting that perception of people.
Scarce municipal resources are spent on the small population.
I don't even know if you could figure out what the expense would be. But I can tell you that, 5% of the population absorb 90% of the fire and police and ambulance. How many times have you got picked up by ambulance on the street or picked up by the police department? Yeah, I'm saying that these people take an enormous amount of our energies.
You might run into them 3 times a shift, I would imagine. And that's a 24-hour shift.
I've had constituents talk to me about, they never see a police cruiser on their street. And how do you explain to them that you don't, because the amount of calls that the police get, and it's the same people over and over and over again. And that's not even considering the court system. What is it costing in the court system for these people? I'd say the cost would be mind-boggling.
But both Kevin and Joel emphasize that not all the street people have substance abuse problems.
There's 2 different cultures out on the street, maybe 3, but the drug people don't connect with the alcohol people. It's 2 entirely separate groups. There's a 3rd group. The 3rd group are the people that aren't alcoholics, they're not drug people, they're just street people. Somewhere they fell off the turnip wagon.
There's a couple out on the street right now that has some mental health issues, and they don't have any substance abuse issues. They just don't trust anybody.
Both also agree that housing could be a major factor in getting people off the streets.
I think we have enough services out there. Having shelter, maybe a wet shelter would be good.
Or
Having a legal tent city. Someplace that right now we have, 40 to 60 people living outside and in tents and scattered sites. It would make sense to have a tent city that we had some kind of control over. Not control over, but just a general area that we knew where they were, we knew what was going on.
Was Seattle, Washington had a program where they identified some of these people and they actually put them in public housing. So now they had a place to live, had a place to drink. But what they found was the strain on the finances on the city had started to lighten up, and that actually some of these people who were acute alcoholics started thinking about maybe quitting drinking, and some of them were successful, some not. But it's a strange idea in a sense, but what's it costing us now? I mean, we don't even know. I don't even think you could figure it out.
life is not good for street people. Fitchburg firefighter and EMT Chad Quartermarsh sees it in his job almost daily.
We've had just, a few that have either died from overdoses or have died from like alcohol poisoning or just, too much use of alcohol over the years. Had a couple people that we came to find out that just froze to death over the winter time because they didn't have any place to stay with heat.
It is difficult for those working in their behalf.
If you ask any police officer, he's going to tell you that. He's going to tell you the real story. This is a society that we don't want to know that much about, or the general public does not. I would never go home and tell my mother the stories that I saw. The people that we see pushing the carriages around, their life expectancy is very short, and they're going to end up, you know, beaten to death or frozen to death. You know, it's a very real problem in our city and many cities like us.
As a beat cop, Joel saw this firsthand.
I'll tell you a story. Back when I was walking the beat, the intermodal was new, and we had problems, especially on cold winter nights, where, you know, a lot of these people sleep outside, you know, and so on a very, very cold night, they would end up in an intermodal to stay warm. And after a while, it became a problem. It became a problem with safety, with people using the train system, and so we finally had to come up with a way to keep them out. So what we did is we would tell them, we would have the management tell them in front of us that they weren't welcome back in, and if they came back in, they'd be trespassing, and I could arrest them. On this one particular night, it was real cold, and a guy that I knew, they didn't want him in there. And understand that they weren't just throwing them out because they were street people or alcoholics. They were throwing them out because they were problems. They'd be loud, and so this guy was thrown out. Anyway, I got there that night, and it was cold. It was real cold, and he was shivering. His lips were black, and he was inside, and I had to make him leave, and nowhere to go. Nowhere to take him. He wasn't allowed in the Valentin shelter, and I didn't know what to do. So I gave him a couple dollars to go get a hot cup of coffee across the street, and he told me that he couldn't go in Dunkin' Donuts because he wasn't allowed in there. So I told him, well, go over there and tell him I said it's okay, and I'll be right over. And what I was doing is trying to buy myself some time to think about what I could do. And by the time I made my rounds and got across the street, he was gone. And he was found frozen to death the next morning.
Social workers cover the gamut: children, elderly, and everyone in between. Ultimately, the help given depends on the person receiving it.
So it's really just checking, it's visiting with people, you know, and finding out what are your needs, and I can help you with those needs. I'm going to help you help yourself.
But there continue to be needs, of course, but that's what social service is all about. Identifying a need, not taking over for somebody when they should be doing something, but giving a hand to them. That's what social service is all about, should be all about.